Sure, thank you. Thanks a lot for that introduction. So this presentation has been kind of adapted after giving it a few times to different groups. So, I hope everything is kind of pertinent to your group, and I really hope that everybody, gets what they were hoping out of this presentation. So I'm Vivien Barnett. During the time that I was completing this project, I was the Curatorial and Collections Specialist at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Right now, I am a museum contractor. As you can see, I gave this presentation to the Small Museums Association a couple months ago and left that on the title slide. So this presentation is going to start with, I would love to get a little feedback from everybody in attendance on, what you know about the subject already or what you're hoping to learn about it. And then an overview of the law, as well as followed by a case study of my own project, just to show you what the actual process looks like, because learning about it and doing it are two very different things. And then I will leave you all with some resources so that you can do your own further research afterwards. So I have a couple questions here. Please feel free to just unmute and answer, or you can use the raise hand function if you would prefer that. So the first question is, what does repatriation mean to you, and why do you believe it is important? Two-part question. And then what are you hoping to get out of this presentation? So would anybody like to jump in? This happened last time and I had to start calling on people, so.
I will go first, Sandy, and I think what it means to me is to give back something that didn't belong to you in the first place. So that is why I feel it is important to right a wrong, so to speak. And I'm here just to get more information since I am not familiar with this subject.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share before we move on?
Hi, Vivien. I've done a little bit of archaeology, and I don't know that much about NAGPRA, but what I think I know is that the way it was explained to me was that repatriation is the same as if anybody had an ancestor whose body was being held and not returned to the soil, if that's how their culture is. So I think it's very important to get these people back to their families and to their culture. And I'm just hoping to get a little bit more understanding about NAGPRA from this. So thank you.
Great, thank you for sharing. So you're already touching on some of the really important aspects of this law, and so now that I've tortured you all by making you jump in, I can go ahead and get started with actually getting into what does this law do. But also, of course, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement statement. So the land on which you are standing is the ancestral land of the Piscataway Nation. The Piscataway Nation's territory stretched from present-day Charles County to Baltimore County, and from the Chesapeake Bay to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. So this is the acknowledgement statement that was used at Maryland Center for History and Culture. They were still developing it at the time that I left the museum, but it's really important to start conversations about, especially conversations about, Native people and their heritage and culture, with an acknowledgement of the land on which we're currently standing that was, that originally did not belong to us. So as well as there are 3 state recognized tribes in the state of Maryland. That includes the Piscataway Indian Nation, as I mentioned, the Piscataway Conoy tribe, and the Akahannock Indian tribe. And as you can see, they were all only state recognized within the last decade or so. So there's, this is a really ongoing and current thing. People are still around who have a vested interest in, having items returned to them. And, I always want to honor these cultures and these communities when I talk about this subject. Okay, so now we can get a little more into it.
Vivien, can I interrupt real quick just to point out that there's
Absolutely.
some questions coming in the chat, and I'm not sure if you're following those or not. We could wait till the end, or if you want to see them as they come up.
Sure. Let me see about the questions. I'm hoping that some of these questions will be answered in my presentation, so maybe we can hold off until the
Yeah,
end.
figured that, just making
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
Thank you.
But please keep them coming, and please like pop them in the chat as they occur to you. Okay, so just a little background on the project and how I got into this work. So when I first started at MCHC in 2020, I knew that the museum had a collection of Native American artifacts that had remained relatively untouched. And that was something that I knew I wanted to change. So I began by looking in a binder in the curatorial office that was marked Native American artifacts. And upon leafing through the pages of the ledger, I came across these entries. 1 human skull, small. 1 human skull, large. 6 bones, probably human. So realizing that there were Native American human remains hidden within the collection, my first thought was those don't belong here. But then where do they belong, and how do we get them where they need to go? So thus I began to develop this project. I knew about NAGPRA and repatriation in theory, but I had no idea what the actual process was. So my first step was to gain a better understanding of the law and what our responsibilities were. And I also would like to take this moment to issue a disclaimer. There will be no photos of human remains or any sacred objects in this presentation, not just because it would make people uncomfortable, but also just out of extreme sensitivity to how cultures would like their ancestors and their objects to be treated. So I hope that this is a really positive and educational experience, but also, you know, I always do try to say, let's keep in mind the seriousness of the topic as well. And these are real people's lives and ancestors and objects. Not that I'm worried about anything with this group. So now, what exactly is NAGPRA? It is an acronym that stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This law was passed in 1990. And it provides a framework for tribal members to stake a claim for repatriation for items of cultural patrimony. And we'll get into the definition of what all of those objects are. So this law required museums or any collecting institutions to report any Native American objects that they had in a summary by, I believe, 1993. And then a more complete inventory was supposed to be published by 1995 in the Federal Register. So, you know, naturally, every museum did exactly that on time, right? You know, unfortunately, no, that's not the case. And as was mentioned in the introduction today, an estimated 50% of museums in the country are still out of compliance with this law over 30 years later. So I still wanted to understand the process further and what the museum's duty was. So I continued to research the terms of the legislation. And without going into the entire painful history of colonialism and the widespread genocide of Native American peoples, I do want to stress how important the passage of this law really was. So while today it might seem obvious, this law faced many challenges in previous iterations before it was finally passed in 1990. Since Europeans first began to colonize North America, Native peoples were murdered, exploited, had their land stolen from them, as well as their cultures and languages erased. And even into the 20th century, so-called collectors were desecrating sacred sites, stealing and plundering artifacts in order to preserve and display them in Eurocentric museums. So this law aimed to be an antidote to those unlawful, immoral practices of collecting, with its main focus, of course, being repatriation. So imagine if somebody was to disinter one of your own family members and claim ownership over their body. And as horrible as that sounds, this is an unfortunate reality for many Indigenous people and cultures today. So one facet of this law, which I will not cover as extensively in this presentation, simply because it's been tailored more towards museums, is graves protection. So as previously mentioned, one of the catalysts for the enactment of NAGPRA was the pervasiveness of the looting of Indigenous land and cultural sites, whether through archaeological excavations that were or possibly were not authorized, or, just plain theft. So this section of the law aims to protect those burial sites from further disturbances via a series of requirements and penalties. According to the law, NAGPRA requires that Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations be consulted whenever archaeological investigations encounter or are expected to encounter Native American cultural items, or when such items are unexpectedly discovered on federal or tribal lands. So while this law doesn't pertain, this aspect of the law does not pertain as much to collecting institutions such as museums, it's still beneficial for everyone to understand this impetus for graves protection, especially in the archaeological community. So what exactly is repatriation then? The term comes from the Latin word repatriare, meaning to return to one's own country, or put simply, to go home again. So when we talk about repatriation, it doesn't just mean returning items to their rightful owners, we're returning people to their rightful homes. And on the museum side of things, it just means legal and physical transfer of control of items is the legal term that they use. So what items are subject to NAGPRA? We've covered a few already. So the three types of objects that are subject to NAGPRA regulations include human remains, funerary objects, and sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony. So the law further categorizes these groups based on how well they're identified in records, kind of. So for example, human remains that have been identified as Native American could be classified as either culturally affiliated with a tribe, or they're culturally unidentifiable due to a dearth of records. The law also pertains to funerary objects, which could either be associated or unassociated with their original burial group. And the law also covers these objects of cultural patrimony or sacred objects. So that means, and is defined by the National Park Service as an object having ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to the Native American group or culture itself, rather than property owned by an individual Native American person, and which therefore cannot be alienated, appropriated, or conveyed by any individual. So simply put, they are communally owned objects which cannot legally or spiritually be sold or transferred. There have also been some recent changes to the legislation aimed at making it easier, putting more of the burden of proof on museums rather than tribes. So it's still being updated to this day. And one of those most recent changes is changing the terminology from something being unidentifiable to focusing on the geographic affiliation. So even if you don't know exactly what tribe it went to, you could say it's geographically affiliated with Western Maryland, because this is where this object was found. And I mean, I could go more into the recent updates, but they're still kind of coming out. So next, who is subject to NAGPRA? Again, something we've already touched on, but just to provide the actual definitions. NAGPRA applies to federal agencies and any institution that has received federal funding since the law was enacted in 1990. So the second group includes museums, universities, as well as state and local governments, and any other collecting institution that, like I said, receives that federal funding. So MCHC, as a museum that has received federal funding, they were compelled to comply with the law. And so, while certainly not ideal, a non-compliant status does not necessarily mean anyone's getting arrested or fined or anything like that. The law is claim dependent, which means that the National NAGPRA office will not investigate any organization without a claim of non-compliance being made by a tribal member. So who can make those claims? NAGPRA specifically requires those institutions to consult with and respond to requests from federally recognized tribes. But what about tribes that only have state recognition, such as those in the state of Maryland, or even no legal recognition at all? So this is a map of the United States that shows the states that have only federally recognized tribes in yellow, states that only have state recognized tribes in red, and then a mix is orange, and the states in gray don't have any legally recognized tribes in their borders. So does this mean that Maryland tribes could not request repatriation? Not necessarily. The National NAGPRA office recognizes that there are many times when non-recognized tribes do have the right to request repatriation, and it encourages museums and other institutions to consult with any party who might reasonably be able to stake a claim. However, when a museum wants to repatriate items to a non-federally recognized tribe, there is a special process, including putting a request through to the NAGPRA Review Committee. So the NAGPRA Review Committee is a group of 7 consisting of tribal representatives, museum professionals, and government officials who are appointed to their terms by nominations from tribal members. The committee oversees all repatriation cases and approves determinations of cultural affiliations. They also help to resolve disputes when tribes make contesting claims. They make recommendations for the future care of repatriated cultural items, and they aid in the decision-making process regarding updates to the NAGPRA regulations. Okay, so now that we've covered the who, what, when, where, why, we can cover the how and talk a little bit more about what the actual process is. And so it actually turns out to be very bureaucratic. And in short, the law requires the publication of certain documents, but in order to complete collections inventories, institutions first have to determine the cultural affiliations of the objects under their control. And often you end up in kind of a catch-22 situation where you need to fill out this form, but you can't fill out the form until you know this information. And then it's just a lot of communicating and, red tape. So this is done, the determination of cultural affiliation is done through consultation with tribal members. So according to the law, you must invite any federally recognized tribe who has the potential to claim the items in your collection based on a, quote, preponderance of evidence, is the term they use, provided by the institution. So how does a museum determine where what cultures their collections came from? So if you're lucky, your collections records will tell you, but this is not always the case, and that certainly was not the case during my project. Often multiple meetings between 2 or more parties are required before cultural affiliation can be officially determined. As previously mentioned, once that determination is officially reached, it must be presented to the NAGPRA Review Committee. So while I did list this step first, this will often not be the case, and you'll see why in a moment. So after you determine the cultural affiliation, then comes the publication of certain documents, including the summary of Native American collections, the inventory of culturally affiliated human remains and funerary objects, as well as an inventory of those that are culturally unidentified or, again, geographically affiliated, and a notice of inventory completion upon the publication. So the summary, which I mentioned briefly before, provides a general overview of all Native artifacts in a collection. So the National NAGPRA Program Office understands that most museums do not have the resources to identify what sacred objects might look like. So the publication of a summary allows tribes to identify those important objects themselves. The inventories are more specific documents that detail only individual objects which are subject to NAGPRA and the cultures with which they're affiliated. So a separate inventory is compiled for objects that have no provenance or no information about the existing culture. And then once those inventories have been completed, you file a notice of inventory completion, which allows other tribes to contest that determination. And after a 30-day period after that has been published, then the repatriation process can begin. And so you would send, not only would you publish these documents on the Federal Register, you'd also make sure to send a copy to any of the tribes who are named in those documents as, maybe having a vested interest to be sure that, they see it and they in that 30-day period and they have the time to make that decision. So after all the paperwork has been published, tribes can then stake a claim for the repatriation of any materials that are determined to be affiliated with their respective culture, usually in the form of a formal letter. And once this claim has been made, the museum has 30 to 90 days to fulfill the request. And then finally, the repatriation, the legal and physical transfer of those objects can occur. So unfortunately, this seemingly simple process is really not so cut and dry, especially when you have objects that pertain to multiple different cultures, or they could be in different stages of this repatriation process, which does happen quite often. Excuse me. And so here, just to simplify that last slide a little further, there are 2 paperwork paved pathways for returning cultural items and ancestors to their cultures, respectively. As you can see, the paperwork required to initiate a repatriation for each differs slightly. And the main difference is that when returning cultural items, a museum must first publish a notice of intent to repatriate on the Federal Register. And that paperwork is not, however, required for the respectful return of ancestors. So now that we've covered the process and the legal side, I'm going to begin the case study of my project working with MCHC's collections. So first, a brief bit of institutional background on the organization. Founded in 1844, the Maryland Center for History and Culture, formerly the Maryland Historical Society, is the oldest continually operating collecting institution in the state of Maryland. The museum collection comprises over 350,000 objects, and the library boasts a collection of over 7 million individual documents. At 34 staff members, which that number might have changed since then, we may not be as small as some of the museums, as some other museums that have these collections, but the museum definitely identifies with that. You know, the struggles that go along with not having a lot of staff members to undertake such a great project. So to move on to the issue at hand, this is the current state of the majority of the Native American artifact collection at MCHC. As you can see, its storage conditions are less than ideal, and the collection is still not cataloged, making it inaccessible not only to staff members, but to the public as well. This is not a pretty picture, and I can say that because I took it. But I think it's important for us to all take a critical look at how these objects have been treated under the museum's care since they first came to the institution. As previously mentioned, my research found that there were definitely human remains within this collection, though thankfully they were stored separately under much better conditions. These boxes mostly contained worked stone objects such as axe heads and projectile points, which thankfully are also rather resilient. So at this point, I'm still unable to determine if I was never able to determine if there were any funerary objects or sacred objects present in this collection because I just didn't get that far in the project. So the first concrete step that I could take was to figure out exactly what is in the collections. And for these purposes, I decided to begin with a survey of the human remains within the collection because I know that they are definitely subject to NAGPRA, and I felt the greatest sense of urgency to return something that's so culturally sensitive. Once I located the collection, I began creating my inventory and documenting every piece. At the same time, I was going through what little records we did have and trying to identify the cultures of origin, but unfortunately that was not always possible. And that had to do with how the Native American collections came to the museum in the first place. So the collection of Native American artifacts spans thousands of objects, including projectile points and worked stone, as well as shells, beads, pottery sherds, and more. And most of the collection came to MCHC, again, when it was Maryland Historical Society, from the Maryland Academy of Sciences, who gave them the entirety of their physical collections in 1975. This organization was originally founded in 1797 with the goal of documenting, preserving, and appreciating the natural sciences and literature of the state of Maryland. Later on, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the group shifted their focus primarily towards archaeology. Their collections originated from all over the United States, as well as from sites in Mexico and Canada, since the group consisted of multiple independent archaeologists who often donated their findings to the organization for well over a century. The Maryland Academy of Sciences shifted its role one final time in the 1970s to their current mission of interpreting science for Marylanders of all ages. Today, this organization oversees the Maryland Science Center located on Baltimore's Inner Harbor. This change in mission was the catalyst for the donation of their entire collections to the Maryland Historical Society in 1975. Needless to say, it can be difficult to transfer thousands of small objects from one institution to another. And while there are some records from this large-scale donation, there seem to be a lot missing as well. This missing information had unfortunately been a detriment to identifying the origins of some of the human remains within the collection. Since more than 50 years had passed since the transfer took place, the chances are pretty slim of recovering any more information about the geographical origins of specific objects within the collection. And as previously mentioned, MCHC was still not up to compliance with NAGPRA over 30 years after it went into effect. I did do some digging into their own records and found that there had been some efforts in 1997 to get compliant, but the trail went cold and the project was left unfinished. The only documentation that we had published on the Federal Register was a partial inventory of culturally affiliated human remains from 1997, meaning that for reasons unknown, this work was started but never completed. This group of remains was previously determined officially to be culturally affiliated with the Pawnee Nation in consultation with archaeologist and Pawnee tribal member Elizabeth Black Owl. We had, however, failed to follow through with the publication of a notice of inventory completion and has still never completed nor published a collection summary, meaning that the museum had never achieved compliance with the law. So finally, I was able to start my inventory of the human remains in the collection to determine exactly what was there, how many individuals were represented, and what condition everything was in. My process was to fill out a condition report for each piece, including a physical description, dimensions, and condition notes. I have to admit that working with human remains was a very humbling experience, and I quickly had to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. However, any negative emotions were readily overshadowed by understanding how important this work was and how much I wanted to help bring these people home. It goes without saying that I'm not an osteobiologist. My degree is in art history. So I tried my best to identify specific bones and condition issues, which alone required a bit more research on my part. And it took me a few months to get through the entire collection, as I could only work on it so much at one time. Not only because of the emotional nature of the work, but also because this was just one small aspect of my job. So I didn't have, every hour to dedicate to it. But knowing that I would not be able to move forward with this project until I had completed that inventory really propelled me through. And so now, without giving away any too many sensitive details, I did want to present some of my findings just to give an idea of the scale and scope of the collection at MCHC. So the only culturally affiliated remains we have are the aforementioned Pawnee ancestors, with a minimum number of 3 individuals represented. That is that abbreviation MNI. So put simply, that number is calculated by adding up all of the left and right bones of certain types and dividing it by 2 and rounding up if you have an odd number. So if you have 3 arm bones, you definitely have more than one person represented in this collection. And then the next group of remains had some documentation as to where they originated, but are yet to be officially affiliated with any tribe. This group consisted of 94 pieces of bone, ranging from complete pieces to minuscule fragments, and also represented a minimum number of 3 individuals. And the last group of remains had no documentation of its origins, making it pretty much impossible to determine any cultural affiliation in the future. This group contains 8 pieces and represents 4 individuals. Once I finished the physical inventory, I wanted to learn as much as I could about the middle group to see if I could make any guess at their cultural affiliation and get that consultation process started. This actually led me to do some digging through museum department records as well as archives in MCHC's library, and I actually kind of stumbled upon a little bit of a scandal there. But so to give you some context on this middle group, these remains supposedly came from 2 sites in Western Maryland, according to what few records there were. The smaller group came from a site in Southern Washington County, and the larger amount were listed as, quote, probably from the Hughes site, which was located in Montgomery County outside of the town of Poolesville, Maryland. Tyler Bastian, Maryland's first state archaeologist, as I'm sure you are all aware, popped up a lot in these records, and the museum had actually consulted with him on this collection in the 1990s. So according to these maps, these sites could have been either occupied by Piscataway or Susquehannock peoples. The latter group is no longer extant as its own tribe and has since migrated or been assimilated into other cultures, including the Iroquois Confederacy. So this gave me at least some idea of who could reasonably have a claim to the unidentified human remains in the collection. Next, I began to research the Hughes site to see what else I could find out. And this is where I stumbled upon a little bit of historic scandal. So the William Bowes-Marie papers, he was an archaeologist and historian in Maryland. I'm sure many of you have also heard his name, and his papers are actually at MCHC's library. So naturally, I wanted to look into his archaeological correspondence, and I noted a lot of familiar names like Tyler Bastian, but I wasn't finding anything until I looked in a folder marked correspondence with an E. Ralston Goldsboro. And I found a detailed story about how the site was first identified in 1937 by Nicholas Yinger and his brother Roy, amateur archaeologists who were mostly interested in turning a profit from their findings. In this letter, Goldsboro wrote of an Aboriginal burial ground on the north side of the Potomac River west of Horsepen Branch. During the past week, Yinger excavated 11 skeletons. Mr. Yinger would like, if possible, to get some Maryland institution interested in the work he has begun, possibly the Maryland Academy of Sciences. One visit to this site and the examination of what Mr. Yinger has collected has led me to believe that this is possibly a Conoy village site and burial ground, made when they went up the Potomac in 1697. It is about 6 miles south of Poolesville and 18 miles by river from Heater's Island. So this is a historical document that actually provides a lot of information about this historic archaeological site that might have a collection 2 pieces within MCHC's collection. So another thing it tells us is that, unfortunately, these amateur archaeologists, the Yinger brothers, removed tens of individuals from the earth and sold them indiscriminately to collectors and museums, meaning it's very plausible that members of the Maryland Academy of Sciences could have procured some of the ancestors for their collection, which later on moved on to the Maryland Historical Society. So this is an example of the preponderance of evidence that you would present in consultation meetings with Native American tribes in order to help make that determination of cultural affiliation. Excuse me. So another resource that aids in connecting locations to present-day Indigenous groups is the Tribal Directory Assessment Tool, or TDAT for short. Hosted by the Office of Environment and Energy, this ArcGIS web-based program lists any and all tribes who have a vested interest in an area down to the county throughout the US and beyond, as well as the contact information for representatives of those tribes. So it's a really useful tool. So as an example, here's what happens when you click on Maryland. A pop-up lists out the counties for you to choose from, or you could choose to see all tribes who are interested in Maryland. So I clicked on Montgomery County, the home of our other as yet unaffiliated ancestors, and 3 tribes popped up: the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and the Seneca Cayuga Nation. So because NAGPRA requires you to consult with only federally recognized tribes, as I mentioned previously, these would be the first tribes to contact for consultations before extending the invitations to Maryland state recognized tribes. You have to, legally, you have to provide this opportunity to the tribes with that vested interest. But if you let them know, our evidence shows that this was likely related to a Maryland state tribe, you can let the tribes work it out themselves. So it's not the museum's place to make any of those decisions, but all you can do is invite everybody to the table and share what information you do have. And so also, as I mentioned, the staff of the then Maryland Historical Society in 1997 had failed to follow through with filing paperwork that was required to initiate the repatriation process for the remains determined to be affiliated with the Pawnee Nation. In April of 2022, I was able to file this paperwork 25 years late, and after a mandatory 30-day waiting period, the Pawnee Nation was able to officially stake a claim for their return. And the correspondence and planning took months, but in September of 2022, Marty Only a Chief, pictured here, the NAGPRA coordinator for the Pawnee Nation, was able to drive up to Baltimore from her home in Oklahoma to complete the transfer, thus marking MCHC's first ever repatriation in its 150-year plus history. It was an incredibly proud moment for me and everybody involved. So those three ancestors made their way back to Oklahoma in Marty's Jeep, and after sitting in a museum collection for nearly 50 years, they were finally returned to the earth in a reburial ceremony a few months later. So it was beyond an honor to play a part in the journey home for these Pawnee ancestors, but there was still more work to be done in the collection as well. And I also would just love to shout out my wonderful colleague, Karen Gazier here. She was our grants coordinator who helped me apply for grants and was with me every step of the way, as I had, a lot of nerve-wracking phone calls with the federal government about being out of compliance with the law. And so I really couldn't have done this project without her help as well. So an article was published in, I believe it was February of this year, about this repatriation as well. I think I've sent it to Matthew, so hopefully you all have had the chance to read it, or do get the chance to read it. Please look it up if you haven't. So we worked with the reporter Clara DeLongo Freitas to provide her with more information about the NAGPRA process. We connected her to everybody who was involved with the return, and we really wanted to tell the whole story. And I believe that total transparency about NAGPRA subject collections is of the utmost importance. But we also wanted to be careful about how we shared this information as well, because it's so culturally sensitive. So this was the first time that it was talked about publicly by the museum. Oh, sorry, it looks like my camera might have froze there for a second. And I just wanted to share a brief excerpt from the article in Clara's words, and in Marty's own words, actually. Marty Only a Chief started her Jeep, turning on the radio as she left Baltimore behind. It had been a long drive, more than 20 hours, stopping once in Nashville, Tennessee. But she didn't complain. Her relatives, as she calls them, had had a much longer journey. You probably haven't heard this music, but this is what I listened to, the 60-year-old said to the ancestral remains of her relatives, sitting in a cedar box in the back of her Jeep as a country song blasted from the speakers. Later on, Marty states that while she wishes this return could have happened sooner, she was just happy that it had finally happened. And she said, it's bringing our people home. So as I said, please give the rest of the article a read if you haven't already. It was wonderfully written by Clara. So moving on with the project, consultation and repatriation are big components of the project, but another big part to tackle was the completion of the NAGPRA summary, which still hadn't happened. So according to the NPS NAGPRA website, a NAGPRA summary is a general description of Native American unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony in a holding or collection of a museum or federal agency. A NAGPRA summary is an invitation to Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to consult. So invitation is really the operative word there. The program recognizes, as I said, that museum professionals are not the best equipped people to identify those objects. And so putting that summary out there and giving people the opportunity to look it over and say, oh, that looks like the object that we're missing, is really the important thing with a summary of cultural items. So I mentioned before that we had a binder that was labeled Native American artifacts, but this is just one page out of hundreds of those to give you an idea of what that looks like and what goes into preparing a summary. So each page lists out the object ID, the quantity of objects, a brief description of them, any geographic information, and then any other supplementary information as well. And because there's no digital record of that collection, I was tasked with digitizing the entire binder, which would be incredibly time consuming. But because of the importance of preparing the summary as an invitation to those tribes to consult, I started out by putting everything into Excel and trying to make sense of this plethora of data. So here's a look at the Excel sheet where I was inputting data from the ledger. before I really got going, I really wanted to make sure I was organizing it in the most efficient and useful way. So I asked some experts for their advice. Melanie O'Brien, the head of the National NAGPRA program, gave me the very helpful advice of letting the geographic information lead the way, as this will inform you which tribes would be interested in those materials. So I was able to co-present on the topic of preparing these summaries to the NAGPRA community of practice, who I'll talk about a little later, with some colleagues from Nebraska. And through this network, someone contacted me to volunteer their time to assist with the project. So working just a few hours a week, this volunteer had been able to input over 75% of the ledger so far. He had almost finished the project by the time that I had left my position. And once that spreadsheet is complete, it can be used to really start to make those affiliations and those connections by looking at the geographic information as well as the types of materials. Using some of those tools as well that I mentioned, like the Maryland State Arts Council maps, as well as TDAT and others. And so that's kind of where I left off with the project, but some of the next steps that I was hoping to complete include contacting tribes to set up consultation meetings, submitting a grant proposal to really fund this work, as well as to fund setting up those meetings, to fund staff time and materials for researching and inventorying the collection, finishing and submitting the NAGPRA collection summary, and continuing to build partnerships and with Indigenous communities of Maryland and beyond. And then as well as cataloging the rest of the Native American artifact collection, which is a huge undertaking, and I hope it happens someday. And additionally, while I was working on this, I also wanted to take a look at the extent of our historical Native American interpretation, which was at the time limited only to one gallery in the museum. So of the objects you see here, only one of these objects was made by an Indigenous person, and the other two depictions by white artists are layered with colonialist symbolism. So I was working to repair previous descriptions of the artworks that might have been inaccurate, overly homogenizing, or potentially harmful in any other way to Indigenous communities, both in the galleries and in the online collection. In order to authentically improve the representation and interpretation of Maryland's Indigenous history and culture at MCHC, improving the way that we treat those Indigenous objects behind the scenes is just as important to me as building relationships with contemporary communities. So prioritizing the cataloging, processing, and rehousing of our Native American collections, or their collections, would really show that it's coming from a place of authentic care, and that the museum cares about more than just outward appearances and building relationships without doing the work that's required. And then other steps related to that would include attending more frequent Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs meetings, developing a really comprehensive institutional land acknowledgement statement, and donating to and supporting local Native organizations. So I will definitely make this presentation available to your group after this so that you can have access to some of these resources that I've put together. But I'll just go over a few of them. So the National Park Service NAGPRA website, is the official hub for information on NAGPRA. It's really comprehensive, so I definitely encourage you to click around on the website if you have more questions. That's where I did a lot of my research and learned what I was working on, as well as some of the grants that I was applying for are accessible through this website, so I can talk more about those as well. They also have a YouTube channel where they have previous symposia and presentations put together on really specific NAGPRA topics. So if it's just the basics, or if it's about the review committee or any questions you have, there's probably a really long video on their YouTube channel about it. So that's a great resource. And there's Karen and I working on our grant together. So they have the National Park Service offers 2 grants for completing NAGPRA projects. There's the Consultation Documentation Grant, and that funds consultation meetings, which would involve maybe the tribal members traveling to your museum, so it pays their per diem, their travel, their accommodations. It also would pay for archival materials if you're processing and inventorying a collection, training, and for staff and anybody working with the collection, and staff time on the project. And then there's a repatriation grant as well that is kind of the same thing, but it goes to cover the cost of an actual repatriation, including travel to complete the transfer, as well as any ceremonial supplies and the cost of reburial for the tribes. And I have mentioned the NAGPRA Community of Practice. They are a wonderful resource. They meet bi-monthly, their Zoom meetings. They are hosted in Denver, so I always got the time wrong every time I went to sign into one of their meetings. I was an hour early. But they're a really wonderful group. It's NAGPRA practitioners, museum people, students from all over the country who come together to discuss different topics of NAGPRA, to work through issues that they're having. I received a lot of help during my project. I've met some wonderful people. So if you want to be more part of the community, it's completely free, and you can just jump into a meeting and see some of the great guest speakers. So that's great. They also have a whole Google Drive that has, people, when they have put together policies for their museums, they'll share what that policy looks like. And so it's a really great give and take. And there's a lot of really great resources just in this one group. And here are some books that I found really helpful during my project as well. Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits is a really great read. It's like a narrative nonfiction all about the history of the NAGPRA law, and it's kind of formulated based on case studies. The middle book I've heard a lot about. I haven't read that one yet. And the book on the right was actually put together by my former professor, Dr. Vicki Kassman, who was an expert on the preservation of human remains. And she has since passed away, but I feel really honored to kind of continue her line of work as well, and that I had her book to guide me as I was working on this. And I just want to say thank you to anybody who worked on the project with me and who helped along the way, and especially to the NAGPRA program officers and to Marty, only a chief from the Pawnee Nation. So there is my presentation. I hope you all liked it. And now we can open up the floor for questions. Yes, please just feel free to jump in.
I'm going to speak with the microphone. Is that okay?
Yeah, no
Sure,
problem.
Richard. Yep.
Yeah, this is so excellent. I have many questions, but may I ask two?
Yes, go ahead.
And I'm interested self-centeredly in Maryland. And
Me as well.
and we know that, for instance, John Smith discovered Powhatan Indians that were in the area. Algonquins are much larger class, but there were tens of thousands of those around. And you can just read all the rivers that dump into the Chesapeake if you want to see Native American tribal names. But the only one you mentioned were Piscataway, the Piscataway tribe, which somehow I missed and wasn't aware. Is that how does that relate to the Powhatans and the Algonquins, for instance? Would you know?
That's a great question. So I was really just looking at the specific areas where I knew our objects had come from. So for instance, the Akahannock tribe are located in like the southeast point of Maryland. And so these sites that were on the western border, I didn't see as much of a connection there. And I also used the TDAT system to identify the tribes that would be interested. So unfortunately, my research doesn't really extend to, all of the tribes who were in the entire state of Maryland over, centuries, or actually thousands of years. But so I really was only focused on those specific areas, but I definitely intend to learn more about local Native history and if anybody does have any more information, I'm always happy to listen to that. So, and did you have another question?
I did, yeah, but thank you. That's, I didn't really expect you to know. But it shows me that I need to do a heck of a lot more reading. It's a lot more specific history for Maryland that I was aware of.
Absolutely.
Number two was you had 3 Pawnee affiliated individuals that were repatriated.
Mhm.
Can you just say a couple sentences about what constitutes good evidence for identifying them as Pawnee? What
Yeah.
do we know or see or have that tells you that's what they were?
Sure. So the only reason I knew that is because that affiliation had already been made in the 90s. So the remains were found in a box that had written on it, Pawnee remains from Nebraska. So, based on that, they're like, well, this is the best information we have to go on. And so they invited a tribal member from the Pawnee Nation, as well as our archaeologists from the Smithsonian, and they did the formal consultation, and it was determined that that was enough evidence. And so it went through the NAGPRA review committee and everything. It was officially signed, and just the paperwork and the follow through had never happened. So I was just kind of picking that up where it left off and finishing it up. And actually, Marty, who was like a wonderful, very kind person, she let me know that Elizabeth Black Owl, who was the one who signed the papers in the 90s, she was Marty's aunt. And so Marty was really honored to be able to pick that up and finish the work of somebody that she really cared about as well. So it was just a really touching process from beginning to end.
Yeah, I can tell that this is a journey that 99 and 44 100s of people never get to even see or hear about, that you've been through here. This was really an education. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, absolutely. And my whole thing with presenting on this is, it was such an undertaking for me to understand the law and the process and go through it. And I'm like, if I could make that process a little bit easier for one other person, one other institution, and get more of this work completed, then I'll be really happy with that.
You have.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Vivien, I'm going to go through a couple of questions that are in the chat here, and you can address those.
Sure.
There's one here. I think we know, does state recognition of tribes mean that the tribes are recognized by federal government as well? I believe you said there was a distinction, but maybe you want to say something about the process, like how do you get to be federally recognized, and is that relevant to what we're doing here?
Sure. Yeah, it definitely is relevant. And so there is a distinction. So a federally recognized tribe would also be state recognized, but a state recognized tribe is not recognized by the federal government. And that has a lot more to do with just NAGPRA. It also relates to, reservation lands, what resources tribes get from the government. And I will say, actually, after I presented on this at the Small Museum Association conference, a woman from the Lenape tribe came to me, and after my presentation, she said, federal recognition or state recognition isn't the end all be all goal for all tribes. Many communities don't want government oversight into, their communities and their lives. So I'm only speaking about it within the context of NAGPRA and what the law requires. So it is a lot about, do you have original documents that show that you occupied this land in the 17th century, who has that? So it's actually a really difficult process. And that's kind of why it's so much more recent that a lot of tribes are getting that state recognition. So definitely encourage you to do more research on that if you're interested. That is not like my area of expertise, but I'm happy to clear up that distinction.
Thank you. And here's another one. What if the remains are of a person whose home was in one place and died there, but their people have since been moved somewhere else, so their remains buried by the people in the new place? Is that more or less what happened with the case of Marty, only a chief who came from Oklahoma?
Yeah, absolutely. So that happens all the time because, these are people who were systematically displaced for generations. So it generally you would go with it's whatever the tribe wants. That once you relinquish that control, there's, you don't have any say in it. So most often tribes have now their own land, and that's where they would like their ancestors to be reburied. Or, if they wanted to work it out, there are some burial grounds, in certain states that are, controlled by state entities and used at discretion. So often, an individual would be reburied far away from what was actually their home, but in a place that is home to their descendants. And that's what's really important. But yeah, it's all up to the tribe's discretion at that point.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
I'm just looking in the chat. If there are no other questions, then I've done a really great job. So thank you
know a
all,
lot
and
more
please
than
feel
we
free
did an
to.
hour ago, that's for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if anybody, is working at an organization that might have something that's subject to this, I'm absolutely happy to consult on things like that. Because like I said, I want to bring more people home, and I want to encourage this work being done.
Thank you. And I
Yeah.
will also share with the rest of this group those resources that you made available, including the article from Baltimore Banner, although Ilka put it in the chat for us earlier. I'll share that with you all. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
That was really informative and much appreciated.
Awesome, thank you all for having me.
Take care, everyone. See you next time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.